Now, we've spoken a lot recently about companies moving to net zero carbon emissions, or even in some cases going carbon negative. It is, of course, easier in some industries than other, and aviation is surely one of the most challenging. Well, the private charter flight company Victor says it's carbon negative by offsetting emissions, and it will publish all details of its environmental performance to lead the industry in transparency. Well, joining me now is Clive Jackson, the founder and chairman of Victor. Clive, morning to you. I assume private aviation must be pretty terrible, even compared with commercial aviation for emissions per head.
I think certainly when you look at the emissions per seat, private aviation can be as much as 20 times more carbon than flying on a commercial airline. But no question, since COVID, we've seen a massive drop off, over half in terms of emissions across Europe between private and commercial. But we are all hopeful that that's going to come back. And when it does, we have an obligation to do something, and certainly to start thinking about how we build back better and to do it with some really positive action.
Clive, I imagine your clients, by and large, they're pretty wealthy, they're well educated, they must know all about their carbon footprint. Is this something that they've urged you to do, or is it something that you've driven from the top down?
Well, Ian, it's been 20 months since I was last on your show, and in July 19, Victor announced that it was going to become a more sustainable aviation company, address the issues of emissions, and just recognize the fact that we all want to travel, and a lot of us still want to travel internationally. And, clearly the pandemic has had an impact on that. But for those that can fly, one of the most important things that we've got to recognize is that if you create a carbon footprint, you have to clean up. And that cleanup process is about awareness and education. And today in our industry, in the private aviation industry, where we have some of the world's most influential and wealthy and important people flying today, and they'll fly again tomorrow, it's their responsibility to start to mitigate the impact of their choice, because it's a choice and it's a privilege. And that privilege comes with an obligation. So that obligation must mean you have to clean up, not just once, but twice, but maybe even more, in terms of mitigating the total effects of your flight and all the emissions. And that starts with a series of activities and programs around offsetting, and also driving the industry into helping create more sustainable and alternative fuel sources. And that's incredibly important.
And who are you offsetting your carbon emissions through, Clive?
I beg your pardon?
Who are you offsetting your emissions through?
We offset our emissions through a series of approved United Nations regulated activities. Some of that is to do with being able to protect rainforests, because clearly it takes a long time to grow a forest and plant trees. So preventing the deforestation is one very big part of that impact. So we have a series of programs around the world that focus on it. But in addition to that, we've also got to look ahead, and we've got to think about producing more affordable, sustainable aviation fuel. And yes, it's available in the market today, but it's in minuscule numbers. So we have to think about how technology can play out. How can we reduce the contrails, which are those white vapor trails that come off the back of a jet when it flies through certain air temperatures and altitudes? And that in itself will help stop the amount of radiation that's being reflected and its impact in terms of A, emissions, and B, warming. So there's a whole host of activities that have to be played out. But Ian, one of the most important things that we need to see today is positive and direct action. And that means that airlines, private aviation companies, and consumers not only must recognize that they do pollute, but fundamentally we have to publish these figures. And I think Victor, back in July 2019's efforts to say, yes, we're going to do something about it, has now been backed up with the fact that we've now turned over all of our data. That's our flight emission data, our total carbon footprint, and most importantly to your question, where we're going with our offsets. Where do we redeem our offsets? What do they look like? How much do they cost? And I think that will set a benchmark for other people in the industry to follow. It's no good saying you're doing something. We need to see transparency, we need to see honesty, and we need to see positive evidence published by third parties that people who claim to do this are actually doing it. And I think
right,
that
Clive.
would be the first big step.
Good to see you again, Clive. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, interestingly, we've just heard from M&G, the big asset management giant here in the United Kingdom. It said it will give shareholders a vote on its climate change plans at its annual general meeting next year. It plans to be carbon neutral itself by 2030, and then emissions from all its internal and external investment portfolios will be neutral by 2050.